Tell you something. If you two ever bother me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving up that shit. I can't. There's good friends of mine out there fucking shit. Well, he's the boss, you have to do his part. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the money is. I want to know that the boss is your boss.
We talked about the ebb and flow of the Philadelphia Mafia and how Angelo Bruno was establishing a foothold within the city and growing in power, surely by the flow of money heading back north. And so we're going to pick up right there. So as Angelo Bruno's name began to encircle Philadelphia, the local police began to take note, as well as those that Bruno affiliated himself with, like Carlo Ippolito, who down the line would invest in businesses in Cuba with Bruno and Anthony Caponegro. And as we know, Caponegro would eventually pull the strings on what would end the life on Angelo Bruno. However, that being said, you might be surprised to know that they never really liked each other one fucking bit very much. And a lot of their static came from jealousy within the ranks of the Philadelphia mob. A lot of guys saw Bruno as rising too quick, not by sheer gangsterism, but more so by repaying off New York guys for their affection. And it truly rubbed Caponegro the wrong way. Considering, the fact that Caponegro had worked his ass off to get where he got. And he saw Bruno as a guy basically paying for the position. And it's that sort of petty jealousy that has always fueled Philadelphia from day one. And you don't have to look too far into the history to see it. Jealousy and greed have always fueled Philadelphia and always will. Caponegro wasn't the only one who felt that way, but he was the only one who didn't hesitate as early as 1952 and then again in 1958 to openly talk about killing Angelo Bruno to get him out of the way. And that beef goes back longer than most people would ever fucking know. In fact, I bet none of you knew that. But Bruno was smart enough to put himself around guys who could further his financial aspirations and avoided men who were out for themselves and themselves only. He liked guys who were just out making money and who were not looking to advance their standing in the street based off his acumen or his reputation. And someone who Bruno found himself around was Dominic Colozzi, who was the brother of several beat cops in Philadelphia. Now, Colozzi had a long rap sheet which included white slavery charges, gambling, and racketeering. And this is one reason why Bruno never worried about Dominic's brothers being cops, because he had such a long criminal and extensive record. And while others might have turned their back on their brother, the brother of a bunch of Philly cops, Angelo embraced it, which was against the rules. And it turned more than one head in South Philadelphia. Angelo would venture down to Florida and begin dumping money into real estate and legitimate enterprises like gay clubs, nightclubs, casinos, and etc. And it was those Jewish gangsters who Bruno had become so close to that helped facilitate these real estate deals, making them look legit. Angelo would also dump money into casinos in England as well as Miami and the Caribbean. Angelo Bruno, Raymond Patriarca, and Carlo Gambino would dump money into gambling dens in the Caribbean together. And not bad for a guy who was not even a boss yet. But it's deals like this in which Bruno paid the tax on. He had the Jewish mob guys handle all of it, and that impressed Patriarca and Gambino. On the home front, Bruno would begin buying property in Center City and South Philadelphia using the Jewish gangsters as fronts. This way, Bruno had no legal ties to any real estate. He would also use his wife to front these real estate holdings. He knew that the less his name appeared in anything legally documented, the better off he would be. And by the 1940s, Bruno's home life was quiet and low-key. Even if his income stream had utterly put him in a new tax bracket, He remained in a 2-bedroom apartment with his wife, his son Michael, and daughter. And every few months, he would leave for Florida for a couple of months to check on legitimate and illegitimate enterprises down there. And while other mobsters with that kind of wealth were just buying expensive things, Bruno was very frugal. He bought suits off the rack, didn't buy name brand anything. He just bought what he needed and didn't want any attention. His wife Sue was a little different because she wore expensive dresses, fur coats, and jewelry. He drove a simple, inexpensive Ford, and he just lived simply. He also refused to put his kids into Catholic or private schools, which a lot of gangsters were doing during that time period. His children went to public schools. And as his children grew, his daughter would go into a low-tuition college, and his son, same exact thing. His son, Michael, would be given his own exterminating business, and Angelo explained to his children they could have anything they wanted except involvement in any business that Bruno owned or derived money from illegally. And Bruno was pulling in almost $350,000 a year at this point, but claimed he could not afford to buy a home. As we know, years later, he would purchase a home, but like other gangsters of his era, he just didn't spend. In fact, in 1951, when he would be named top hoodlum, he lived almost like a hermit to some extent. And what vexed the feds was how Bruno knew Sinatra and Joe DiMaggio and celebrities that would show up at his home to hang out and eat dinner, but yet Bruno appeared almost poor. A couple of years later, Bruno would finally buy that house, a 3-bedroom row home on 934 Snyder Avenue in South Philadelphia. Angelo didn't go out at night. He was home by 6, and even when he was out a little bit later, his kids would wait up in bed just to eat dinner with him. And Bruno would always help those who were less fortunate than himself. When parish priests needed anything, Bruno took care of it, but Bruno refused to be named in any sort of thank you or any merit. And he didn't want that attention. In many of the churches he took care of, there's not a single memento with his name on it saying that he helped facilitate this building or that. In 1946, Bruno was still operating stills, and he had moved fully into loan sharking, but his loan sharking was intertwined with Jewish gangsters. In South Philadelphia, there were actual members of Murder, Inc. in South Philly at the time, and the Jewish hitman squad for the New York crime families, and Bruno was close to about all of them. In fact, Bruno would end up giving loans to many of the Jewish gangsters, but also regular Jewish people from the neighborhood to start businesses, buy homes, get groceries, anything they needed. That's just how Bruno was. And probably the closest to Bruno from that conglomerate would have been Jewish hitman Samuel Cappy Hoffman and Max Willie Weisberg. Both of them were very close to Hyman Stromberg, a.k.a. Nig Rosen. Rosen was close with Marco Reginelli since the 1930s, and they were all named the city's worst criminal offenders in the Kefauver hearings, which only led to deep investigations by police. And it would just intertwine the Jewish mob with the Italians. Even if the Jewish mob and Italians worked together and were said to be intertwined, they were two separate criminal operations. Informants would explain that even while the Jewish Mafia was not as expansive as the Italians, they worked in tandem in South Philadelphia and were able to earn. Flood Cloisterman, a Jewish mobster, bookie, and racketeer, was said to be making $5,000 a day in the early 50s because Hoffman and Weisberg ensured that he got paid. The Jewish conglomerate always defended the bottom line, and that was the difference between the Italians and the Jews. Bruno, who had issues collecting payments at the time from borrowers, would send Jewish gangsters to go collect for him. And so it was a mutually beneficial relationship. So in other words, if you look at the Italian Mafia, there's 5 families here in New York. Technically, Italians, it was this family. Listen, you could be getting along with the Colombos, for instance, right? But if the Colombos had a beef, you didn't get involved. That's their fucking problem unless it affected your bottom line, which was money. The Jewish mob worked differently. You fucked with one, you fucked with them all. That's what made them so powerful, and that's what made them different than the Italian mob. And as we said before, murder in the old days was not necessary to prove your merit and your might. However, after Luciano takes over, murder had become as important as making money. Today, as we know, it's money, not murder. But after Luciano takes over, murder is on the table and must be done to gain entrance. And it's been said that Bruno committed two murders before 1950. Now, what's interesting, and you guys are going to be blown away, Angelo Bruno was a fucking serial killer. I'm serious. A lot of people, when Bruno becomes boss, he was known to be the docile Don. He didn't believe that murder solved problems. But boy, did this motherfucker murder his way up and did not hesitate to kill one single fucking bit. At all. And you're going to hear about some of those today. So the phone rings at the 33rd Precinct at 7th and Carpenter. An unknown voice on the other end would explain, there's a guy laying in a lot of blood at 10th and Christian and he looks dead. And before the desk sergeant could utter another word, the phone call ends. When cops arrive, they find Joe Payne, 6 feet, 270 pounds, laying face down with 3 gunshots to his head. Witnesses had heard the gunshots and reported it. Witnesses also would say that a car pulled up, guns came out, and the shooting began. And witnesses named 2 of those shooters, Phil Testa and Angelo Bruno. According to those witnesses, Frank Nicoletti was the driver. Informants would tell police later on that Payne, nicknamed Pepe Longo, had been in and around South Philadelphia calling made guys foul names, especially when he was shit-faced drunk. Why does this sound so familiar? Because this is what goes on in South Philadelphia. Salvatore Sabella had known that all too well because he had been a victim of Payne's drunken shit-talking himself. Payne had gone so far as to call Sabella a whoremonger and a rapist. And this is eventually what gets Payne killed. He was just too reckless with his mouth for his own fucking good. And years later, the FBI would find out that Phil Testa became a made man right after that hit. Excuse me. And what's interesting about Phil Testa, because, you know, a lot of times on this show, we've talked about Philadelphia, but we really didn't get into Testa. We're going to get into Testa a little bit today, and I think this is going to clarify a lot of questions, okay? So what's interesting about Testa is that even while he looked at himself as a protege to Bruno, his life of crime, or lack thereof, was front and center. And Testa first gets arrested in 1940, but didn't have a single conviction until 1953 when he does a year in the can for collecting 500,000 slips with bets and 35,000 in plays. Testa wasn't known as smart, and he was not a career-minded criminal. He derived his reputation from Angelo Bruno and hanging around with him, and of course, for the murder of Payne. Phil Testa would not be the guy many would think would become a gangster. He was fairly unattractive, not too bright, and had severe emotional issues. He had a problem taking orders and would take any correction to his actions personally to the point of wanting to kill somebody. And you just could not chastise him for anything. And this is a lot of the reasons why Bruno, when he did need to talk to him, did it slowly, concisely, and never tried to hurt his feelings. And Testa was the type of guy who would fight anybody, yell at anybody if you even looked at him sideways. Whereas Bruno was tactful with police, he was calm and quiet. Testa was the complete opposite. If cops drove by a corner, Testa would scream, call them foul names, tell them to go get fucked, stare them down, and give them the finger. That great South Philly mentality. Angelo Bruno, who's often shadowed by Testa, would find out which cops were driving, and then he would go and apologize later on to the police for Testa running his mouth at them. Testa would even spit on cops and agents, and Bruno tried as hard as he could to get Testa to stop, but he was fucking uncontrollable. And even if Testa was a walking problem for Angelo Bruno, Bruno felt bad for him. And Bruno knew deep down he was loyal, and he kept him around for that reason, but he limited him as to how far he would let Testa do things for him. An informant would say years later to the FBI that Testa was borderline slow and nobody trusted he could run any business. And Testa's background was the mob. Let's just be honest. His father, Salvatore, was one of the first outsiders to be recommended as a member for the South Jersey Philadelphia Mafia. The Testas came from Giardini, Sicily, which is on Sicily's east coast near the Greek settlement of Naxos. He didn't grow up around the Mafia, as the Mafia didn't exist at the time on the East Coast, so everything that Salvatore learned was by example in Philadelphia. Salvatore owned a chicken store at 904 Christian Street, just a few blocks from Salvatore Sabella's store. Salvatore Testa was not a gangster, but more so an ally and supporter of the mob. Think of Jeff Canarsie. It was said that he would get nasty, argumentative, and just him and his son were identical. And the only reason why Bruno, as I said, stuck with Phil Testa is because Testa was loyal. He needed men unwavering in their support. Phil wasn't into drugs, was good to his family, and so those were the positives for Phil Testa. Testa also, despite many opinions saying otherwise, was not a coattail rider. He genuinely loved Angelo Bruno and they were friends. And he was unwavering in that friendship. With Testa not being able to control himself, Angelo Bruno did need some guys to handle business for him, and that came in the form of Harry Riccobeni and Peter Casella. So when Bruno establishes the Penn Jersey vending machine company, he brings in Riccobeni and Casella as partners, and they were located on 775 South 8th Street in Little Italy, with Riccobeni and Casella selling narcotics on the side, or at least aside enough to get the heat off. Bruno brought them into the fold. And it also enabled Angelo Bruno to have a bit more political ties through Riccobeni and Casella. But don't be fooled, because Bruno knew that there were those that did not like him, and with Casella and Riccobeni's ears to the ground, he would benefit from that. He saw the same mentality and acumen with his cousin Johnny Keys Simone and hires him to be his bodyguard. On March 18th of 1955, cops would raid Angelo Bruno's two-story bedroom apartment where Johnny Keys Simone was now residing. When police asked Keys what his name was, he told them John Perna. Cops could care less because they had a warrant for gambling materials. Police had arrived just as Bruno was leaving, and they caught him in the stairwell. Not only did the cops find gambling materials, but walked off with $100,000 in cash. Bruno would tell another mob member that he thought somebody dropped a dime. Both Keys and Bruno would be charged with setting up an illegal lottery. Even though they would get probation for that offense, the heat was now on. So what begins to happen is the feds begin to probe city politicians and police corruption and organized crimes influence on them. And it just got worse because the informants began to come out of the woodwork. The police, and that is the honest cops that were in the city, and those that were not on the take, wanted the mob to take notice. And in January of 54, in the Evening Bulletin, Richard Dilworth admitted that the police had bugged Angelo Bruno's home phone. On those calls, 6 of 28 court magistrates had called him. And it meant, to law enforcement anyway, that the system was now fully corrupt in South Philadelphia and in Philadelphia in general. Having conversations with magistrates isn't a good look. And as you know, magistrates control bail charges and they control everything in this city. And it didn't help that an informant told the cops that Bruno would use magistrates to get his competition arrested. If Bruno wanted you out of the way, he would make a call and that magistrate would have the competition arrested, charged, and off the streets. So once again, we see this rat mentality. And while the Italians had the numbers rackets on lockdown, the Jewish Mafia had their own numbers rackets, which meant that you could bet with the Jews or the Italians. And rather than compete what the Jewish mobsters did that was different, where they gave different betting lines. And that's how they were able to sort of co-compete without making it an issue. But the Jewish gangsters, as we said, were very different than the Italians because all of them had legit enterprises on the side. And those legit businesses allowed them to infiltrate a wealthier section of society. Whereas the Italians were about, I don't care how I make the dollar, I'm just going to make the dollar. Whereas the Jews realized, okay, it could take me 10 years to make $5, shaking these 50 people down, or I can go to a wealthy community and shake down somebody that's got some real fucking money. And that's what the Jews did. So Tom Gibbons, who was the Philadelphia police commissioner, he was a real fucking pain in the ass. Let me tell you, he especially hated Angelo Bruno. Bruno became his highest value target and saw the mob as degenerates. He saw Bruno the same exact way. Witnesses and informants would put Bruno in 3 unsolved murders by 1954, and they would explain in the early days the quiet, humble man who wouldn't hurt a fly had now just begun to kill anybody who meddled in his business. And while there was nothing to substantiate the claims, enough talk was made that made Angelo Bruno's criminal file grow. And his file now read the words, should be considered armed and dangerous. So by 1957, it's been said that Bruno had committed 4 murders by the homicide unit in Philadelphia. Anything Bruno said was reported to police. Things like, I used Irish kids in North Philly to beat people. If you use anybody to kill, you have to have guys to respect. Bruno would just kill if anybody put blocks in his path to take over. And while his desire and acumen and money would help get him there, the police also helped Bruno attain his wealth and his rise to power because they were on the take and they refused to charge him in anything. And the police had 3 names attached to Bruno: Minerva, Payne, and Leonardo, who fired the fatal shots ending their lives. And more names would be coming. Joe Boloma made the mistake of trying to shake down somebody on Bruno's turf. His bullet-ridden body would be found on the street by cops. Weeks later, Marshall Veneziali, a small-time bookmaker who had also made the mistake of encroaching in Bruno's turf, gets shot. In 1954, police would find his body in the trunk of his car, shot 4 times in the back of the head. 1955, Anthony Benedetto, another encroacher, was found in the car under a blanket with his head blown off. A week later, another thorn, Emmanuel Gadabrio, was shot in the back of the head 3 times and was left behind the wheel of his car. Body count, 9. 9. The docile Don, the serial killer. And while cops suspected Casella and others, Casella always had a solid alibi. But then what happens is somebody begins to talk. Even if they could put Casella near the area of different crime scenes, police would receive a letter detailing a lot of different things. This letter explained that at Joe Regnetta's grill, excuse me, let me rephrase. This letter basically unloaded everything. They said who was hanging out at Joe Regnetta's grill, gave all their names and ranks and positions. The letter also suggested that even though Casella was around the murder scene, it was Angelo Bruno who pulled the trigger. And that letter would force police to start asking, and neighbors would explain that on the night of Veneziali's murder, they overheard men arguing and that they saw Angelo Bruno leaving the grill holding a handkerchief over his eye. And the story was that Bruno ordered Veneziali's murder over a beef. And when the shooter got cold feet, Bruno grabbed a gun and handled it himself. Coinciding with that is Bruno shortly leaving the city on a plane, like within hours of that murder. And all the mayhem and Bruno's name attached gives him a ferocious reputation on the streets in South Philly. This terrified certain people, but not enough, because the informants just kept coming. And while it was always 4 or 5, it grew to 20 plus. And Bruno's ever-expanding FBI file, names of tons of confidential informants giving up info on Bruno became immense. And that takes us back to what Caponegro said in the early 50s. It makes sense, and it rings true. Guys in the street didn't like Bruno. They didn't respect him. He hoarded money and didn't get others into his businesses. He didn't share the wealth or businesses with anybody. The fact that Angelo Bruno ordered a death and then did it himself made him look not respected. And the fact that he was essentially shamed into doing it spoke volumes on the street. So in other words, he asked somebody to take care of it for him. They told him to get fucked, which meant he had no respect in the streets. And the fact that he was embarrassed because somebody told him no and had to go do it himself made him look bad in the streets. Whereas Bruno would rather prefer not to get his hands dirty. If he was pushed, he would do it himself. And that should have given him some sort of respect on the streets, but it was almost completely the opposite in Philadelphia. Guys like Caponegro felt he was buying his way to the top rather than earning it. And the other thing that began to happen was that guys who were earning money from Bruno began to resent him. Do this, do that. And the resentment began to grow. The fact that Bruno wouldn't necessarily bring in guys from South Philadelphia, but choose guys from outside of South Philly bothered the shit out of them too. Bruno saw it as guys who just never got past the street corner. He didn't want anything to do with guys that had no ambition. But the guys on that corner saw Bruno for what he was, all for himself. And the corner guys had conned and robbed their ways to get where they got. And Bruno felt he was above all of that. But he wasn't above murder. So by the mid-1950s, Angelo Bruno expands outside of the United States. His personal dealings were much broader than the guys in the corner looking for handouts. In 1956, when Marco Reginelli keels over, the Philly mob was in a bit of disarray. Reginelli had kept the family's inner problems at bay for as long as he could. And Bruno was just merely a soldier at the time, and Reginelli was respected and admired. And police were waiting to see who would replace Ida's underboss in Reginelli. Reginelli, they felt, was actually the boss and a guy who made the machine run. And if they were wondering who would take over next, they wouldn't have to wait long. Rumors began to circulate that Angelo Bruno was going to be the new boss. The problem is, Bruno was just a soldier. He was not a captain. And this would be a move that likely would not sit well with anybody. Keep in mind, Joe Ida was still the boss, but he was staying put in New Jersey and saw Bruno as the guy being used to take the heat away from Ida. Bruno would get the underboss position, and his business responsibilities would change. Bruno begins to look at the unions and how he could infiltrate them, as well when Riccobene takes that huge drug pinch and leaves he leaves his rackets for Bruno to run. When Raymond Long John Mortorano gets pinched for narcotics, the same thing. His businesses are handed to Bruno. And the only competition that Bruno had to becoming boss was Peter Casella. Even with Polina being older and wiser, there were just less eyes on him. For Bruno, it was business as usual. He would head to New York and cultivate personal friendships with more powerful gangsters. It was perhaps his friendship with Carlo Gambino that made Bruno ultimately the goose with the golden egg. Bruno and Carlo became close and would often vacation together with their wives down in Florida. And it's through Gambino that Bruno meets other high-powered gangsters in the United States and in Sicily. And when Gambino becomes the head of the Gambinos, it was good for Gambino, but even better for Bruno. And the second half of the 1950s, pressure was ramping up from law enforcement. With all of the heat, the Mafia in Philadelphia became a little bit nervous. Well, paranoid's probably a better fucking word. The Philadelphia police were still doing what they do today through, Dave Schratweiser and George Anastasia. They were tickling the fucking wire. The police fed the newspapers information on Bruno, and the papers went right along with it, writing huge pieces on Bruno. But they specifically were fed that Bruno was next in line to be boss. They're creating problems and static, and the police knew that it was going to inflame tensions within Philadelphia because they knew that they were dealing with a powder keg. Same shit that's going on today. They would also report on the amount of money Bruno made, further inflaming the Philadelphia streets, making Bruno look like a piece of shit and a greedy fuck. Think about it. Bruno was trying to order guys around, and he was nothing but a soldier. And it would work as Bruno began to feel the pressure and was only infuriating guys on the streets because they blamed Bruno for all of the heat. See how this works? So the FBI and local law enforcement began following Bruno wherever he goes. Anywhere he stopped for 10 minutes got bugged. More informants came out of the woodwork. And that's a large part of the reason why law enforcement believes he took off to places like Florida and Cuba to escape their eyes. And it's been said and reported in both FBI files and in books that Angelo Bruno was at the Havana conference. And what is interesting is that in 1946, Bruno was a fucking nobody in the Mafia. He was a soldier. But what likely got him there was the money that he invested with Carlo and others. The fact, though, he wasn't a policymaker. He wouldn't have any business really being there unless he had friendships. And we also have his forums to leave the United States for business reasons to Cuba and the Dominican Republic. And we know that because at the time he was on probation and needed those forums to leave the country. And it coincides with all of the heat on him at the time in Philadelphia, and it makes sense as to why he went there. But he wouldn't have a seat at the table, but rather a dinner reservation. Nothing more, nothing less. So the informant list gets longer and longer and longer, and Bruno knew that it was just a part of the position. He knew that if he became boss, this would be normal for him. In an FBI report dated in 1957, he had the balls to say to somebody that he was Philadelphia's representative, which was a huge lie, because Joe Ida was the fucking boss, not Angelo Bruno. And that in and of itself probably should have gotten Bruno killed. And the report makes mention that Bruno told a lowly associate of the Philadelphia Mafia that he had all of the power, and he had none. Other reports from 1957 call Bruno the boss of the Philadelphia Mafia, but those are not accurate. And while Bruno was cozying up to New York gangsters, Philadelphia was getting very unstable. Bruno was the second lowest rank in the Mafia. His money-making abilities and his friendships outside of New York, or his friendships inside of New York, are the only reasons that kept him alive. And his attitude, however, kept him in the position. Had he been easier or less full of himself or more available to others within the mafia, perhaps he would have gotten the promotion. For all Bruno was good at, it's what he was not good at, which was amplified among the rank and file and the hierarchy of the Philadelphia Mafia. And when the Calabrians are brought in by Joe Ida, it might have upset the apple cart to some extent. But Bruno uses that to his advantage by inviting them at times to take part in some business deal or this deal or that deal. And he knew that these men under Ragnetta would never forget that. And it would make them eventually beholden to him someday. Ida, perhaps not noticing it, elevates Ragnetta. And he's doing that for two reasons. He elevates Ragnetta. Like they gave it to Bruno for a temporary thing and then they end up giving it to Ragnetta. But that was a message to Angelo Bruno on behalf of Joe Ida. You are nothing. You don't control shit. You are controlled. And we're going to stop there this week because next week when we come back, it's Appalachian. It's Joe Ida and Bruno are going to have a serious problem and some serious shit's getting ready to go down. All that being said, have a great weekend. Feel free to reach out to the show at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com. Keep it dialed in and we'll see everybody next week.